everyone, welcome to International Security and Peace. And today I try to lecture to finish up realism. So we started classical realism and we started structural realism, right? So neo-realism. And then we didn't mention offensive and defensive realism and transitional realism, and then the last one. So let's talk about one by one. International security and peace. So last time we talked about like concept, the basic concept, what is security, what kind of security we are talking about, and whose security we are actually talking about, and different types of securities: military security, political security, economic security, societal security, environmental security. So if you have time, we will all mention five of them. And let's get started with realism. So last time we talked about the major assumptions that realism share with. So that's the major analysis of realism is states. And their interest in power, security, survival, kind of things. And international relations, they looked at in a pessimistic way. The power only, they are not interested in soft power that much. They are interested in material capabilities. So they are interested in like economy power or population, territory, military power, military spending, kind of things. And then they consider international society as a zero sum game. So my gain is your loss, and your loss is my gain. So this is zero sum game. That's realism, and we started classical realism as well. So we covered up classical realism. So I basic idea of classical realism started with the human nature. So they think that the human nature is selfish, self-interested, and utility maximizers. They always calculate benefit and cost. And then uh, the why in international society human nature matters is because of anarchy. So international society is anarchy. There is absence of central government. So there's no one to punish or reward what they do. So that's the anarchical situation. And state based on these anarchical situations, what they can do is lustful power. And why there is war? Because of this aggressive leaders or domestic political system that gives greed power kill. That means that they think that who decide to wage a war is actually leaders. And why leaders decide to wage a war? Because leaders are aggressive, that's self-interested. And that's why state wage a war. The main goal of state is survival. So how can we ensure our survival? To have more power. So that's why there's a war and state wanted to have more power. That's what we actually did. And then we studied a little of neo-realism. Neo-realism, the major difference between classical realism and neo-realism is neo-realism concentrate on the international structure. The international structure lead to a certain behaviors of states. So why how these neo-realists actually starts? They started to they observed that a certain in a certain condition state behaves in a similar way. So that means state actually has a patterns of behaviors, and it's that like that's actually balance of power. That's what I said, right? They criticize classical realism, even though domestic political arrangement or particular parochial histories, states act in a similar way. That's the balance of power. So state try to balance. That's the balance of power theory. Excuse me. That's balance of power theory. So the Kenneth Walsh starts the posit the idea of balance of power, and then the major it starts that domestic political arrangement is different based on the states, right? So you can see the China is not democracy. U.S. is democracy, or economic growth. In terms of economic growth, maybe the U.S. is very wealthy, but other countries are not. But even though these differences, states behavior in a similar way. That's the balance of power. And then why the states behave in a similar way? Because of anarchy. The need for state to provide their own security. So because of anarchy, the state should provide their own security. So we talked about that anarchy makes self-help system, right? So anarchy, no one is secure in anarchical conditions. What they should do is they should provide their own security. And then, so neo-realism, classical realism, they agreed on anarchical condition lead to a certain behavior, right? So why there's war? So it's not about leaders or domestic factors, but international structure makes states wage a war or peace like that. So international structure is can be understood based on distribution of power. So distribution of power means how many great powers we have in international politics. So for instance, right now, and we talked about it right in the class. So we talk about like how many great powers right now, and many of you answered that we have two great powers. That is America, and the America and the China, right? So we have two great powers. Within two great powers, so how is it peaceful or not? So it depends. I mean, peaceful or not. In the bipolar, we call this bipolar. There are two great powers. And if there are more than two great powers, then we call this multipolar. And if there is one great power, it's unipolar. So let's go one by one. So unipolar, he said that based on is it peaceful or not. So he talk about like intentions. We never know state intention. So let's say I bought a military weapons, but I'm saying to you that I bought military weapons of because to protect myself. So it's defensive matter. But you may not believe me, right? Because you never know my intention and you only understand my behavior. My behavior is to buy military weapons. So it's not easy to distinguish whether the weapon is defensive or offensive, right? So you may say, "Oh, she bought a military weapon, so let's buy it again." Like that is like international. That's what happened in international politics. So we never know. We have never known our intention. So because of this intention, but it's hard to understand intentions. But uh, we have to try to understand their behaviors, right? But if there are two great powers and then more than two great powers, so if we compare these two situations, if you are smaller state, which one is better for you to understand the state's behavior? In more than two great powers, the Walt argues that it's more likely to have a war in a two great powers because it's not easy to understand the signals on intentions, right? We never know the intention, but we have to understand the signals that the state sent. So we should understand these, and then it's more likely to misinterpret the state signal, state behavior. So if in more than two great powers, so there is more conflict. The more great powers, the more it's more likely to have a conflict in a situation because of these interpretations of signals. And then the two great power, if there's two great power, this is perfect balance of power, right? So it's not easy to wage a war because it's not because of intention in this time, but because the two great powers actually balanced each other. And then in this situation, since the power is very similar, it's not easy to wage a war or attack the other. And in a unipolar, it depends on completely what kind of unipolar system or what kind of unipolar country you have. So, for instance, we had a unipolar system from after the Soviet Union collapse, 1990, right? From 1990s to 2020, we can say it's unipolar system. The U.S. was the only power, right? I mean, was it peaceful? Yeah, relatively peaceful. We don't have to worry about that much, right? It's because the U.S. is peaceful country. You may say no, U.S. is not peaceful enough because U.S. attacked several countries. Yeah, that's true. But if it's not U.S., but let's say like China or other kinds of regime type, like North Korea, for instance, if North Korea becomes unipolar system, the international politics became completely disaster. It became not peaceful at all, so, right? So it depends on what kind of unipolar country you have. So if unipolar is peaceful, the international politics would be peaceful. And then, but if unipolar is unpeaceful, very conflictual, then the international politics is more conflictual. But imagine the situations in a unipolar system. There it is more likely there are small wars between small countries, because in a unipolar system, think about how many countries we have. Like it's about 200 countries in the world. That if there is one unipolar system, then unipolar countries maybe consider less than 10 countries, right? So U.S. maybe when U.S. was in hegemony country, they it cares only like Middle Eastern areas, right? They are not much interested in like East Asia or Latin Americans kind of countries. They believe that, I mean, U.S. believe that, I mean, these Asian countries or Latin American countries will be loyal to America, so they didn't care much. That if the unipolar didn't care much, then what could it be happen? It happens that a smaller country has more chance to fight each other. Then unipolar, maybe they don't care, right? They don't care much unless that area is what they care about. So let's say like there is war between in Latin American countries, they wouldn't care much because it's not their major concern. But if there is a war, even though it's a small war between Middle Eastern countries, among Middle East countries, then they would care because the Middle East was one of their major kind of issue area. So in unipolar system, I mean, it depend. It totally depends on what kind of unipolar countries we have. But more importantly, we should know that there are like highly likely that there are smaller wars among small countries. That's what will happen. So which uh, distribution of power is most peaceful? It's bipolar because it's perfect balance of power. Even in under these two great powers, under the bipolar system, it never occurs war. It's not easy. So offensive realists actually said the same thing. The like Mearsheimer, he is very offensive realist. Maybe the only offensive realist in international politics, and he argues that we will miss two great powers, the bipolar system, that the U.S., the Russia, hate each other. That system. That's why he argues. It's because he believes also the perfect balance of power will prevent the war between the two countries, two different groups. That's what offensive realism argued too, right? So two great powers often considered as one of the peaceful moments in international politics. It depends on you. So, I mean, can we say if China become one of the great power? Now you're saying like China is already a great power. So if there are two groups divided into two, like that perfectly balanced of power, do you think that it will be peaceful or not? Of course, it's not easy to wage a war, right, against each other for sure. So this is two great power system bipolar. How they act, the state behavior in a certain international structure. So if there are more than two great powers, it's more likely the state wage a war because it's not perfectly balanced. And then they try to understand the signals of great powers. So it's more likely that they misinterpret the state signal. So it's more likely there's war in a more than two great powers. In bipolar, state try to balance each other. So in that case, the states less likely to have a war. In unipolar system, only small there will be smaller wars between small countries. And and the main goal of state is security. If you compare classical realism, it's survival. So survival is the most important, and the security is. I told you that it's different. There's between difference between the security and survival. The survival is, let's look at here. Survival existential condition. The security is the ability to pursue, cherish the political and social ambition. So it's more like future or near future kind of things. Security. So security and survival are a little different. Neo-realism main goal is security, but how can we achieve security to have more power? So it's same. To have more power for neo-realism and security, survival for neoclassical realism, both want you to have more power. An anarchical system and distribution of capabilities are powerful constraints and inducements which produce sameness. So he tried to answer why states act in a similar way. The answer is anarchical system and distribution of capabilities actually constrained the state's behavior or make patterns to for state to act in a similar way. So that's the answer, right? So that's neo-realism. The neo-realism actually go one step further, right, than classical realism because classical realism has their own limitations. Because if you talk about human nature, there's not much to talk about. But neo-realism one step further because it starts with a structural, international structure. And contemporary realism, so this link is linked to Lobel's article. So I don't want you to finish Lobel's article as a whole because it's a lot, but I want you to read at least conquest page or not. So from page, it's quite long article. I mean, it's not that long, but if you have to read, then I'm sure it's not that difficult, but I want you to read from page 1 to page 6. Yeah, page 6. Yeah, page 6. I mean, because the actually when you talk about like defensive realism, offensive realism, it's more like graduate level. So I don't want you to go that deep, but I want you to have the idea what is defensive realism and offensive realism. And first, it encourages state to maximize their security or to maximize their power and influence. So how should we distinguish between the two, defensive and offensive? So offensive means like you know what it means, right? Defensive you try to protect. Offensive you make offend, you know. And so based on which realism, your strategy must be completely different. So when you talk about defensive realism, it focuses on to protect your own states. But offensive, when you talk about offensive, you're talking about like how can you influence, how can you grow your influence, how can you maximize your power. That's the difference between the defensive and versus offensive. But how can we distinguish? The first thing is It encourages states to maximize their security or to maximize their power and influence. So if you focus on maximize their security, it's a defensive realism. And to maximize their power and influence is offensive realism. But why there are two differences between the two? So why their outcome is completely different? And second is whether conquest and expansion pays or not. So that means, let's say, you wanted to expand your power. So how can you expand your power? You make conquest, right? So you wage a war and then you conquest a certain country. That's expansion, right? That's what Japan did, like, or many East European countries did. So expansion, is the expansion pays or not? So is it costs or not? So let's say, I mean, it's certainly very costly. So war itself, wage of war itself, is very costly. So some countries they collapse completely because of these expansions, like Genghis Khan. I mean, it's the Mongolian era was completely collapsed because of this endless expansion. The expansion to wage a war, it's always cost, right? So you should spend a lot of resources. You should spend, like you should sacrifice people. So it's pace. But when you ask whether conquest and expansion pay or not, when you calculate cost and benefits, which one do you think it is? So whether expansion brings about beneficial to the country or not. That's another way to ask. And three, how uncertainty and anarchy work in international society. So uncertainty and anarchy, that's the two things that neorealism even shares with, right? So anarchy, neoclassical realism, neorealism, and contemporary realism, so we call another word structural realism. They share the idea that anarchy makes a state in a behavior in a certain way. But uncertainty is I'm talking about. I explained that we never know our intention. That's uncertainty, right? So when we understand or certain countries behave, certain countries' intention, we should only know their behaviors. We never know what they think. So that's uncertainty. So uncertainty and anarchy, how does it work in international society? So if since it's uncertainty and anarchy, you should defend yourself. That's defensive realist. And then, but offensive realist thinks that we never know our intention. And then, because of anarchy, we should we should have offensive behaviors. But that's a two different things. The three basic standards to distinguish defensive realism and offensive realism. I don't want to go that deep, but that's the three things to distinguish between the two, offensive and defensive. The basic idea, the defensive realists, they accept the basic idea, the neo-realism's assumption, that's security. So we should provide our own security. So the security is the most important for defensive realism. They focus on security. But the difference between the neo-realism or classical realism is security is plentiful. That means security is a lot. So security is not something zero sum game for defensive realism. So we can defend ourselves. That's no limitation. Just because I defend myself, but it doesn't take your defense, right? So that means security is plentiful. So how should we look at plentiful? How should we look at security? Neo-realism security is not something plentiful, right? So it's zero-sum game. I mean, but defensive realism, security is something plentiful. It's different from like zero-sum game. Zero-sum game, but it doesn't mean that defensive realism doesn't accept the idea of zero-sum game. They accept the zero-sum game, but security is something different for them. Power may be limited, but security is plentiful. So you can have your own security. The defensive realism, the anarchical structure of the international system encourage states to maintain moderate and reserved policy to attain security. So defensive realism is so observed in international structure. They think, I mean, there is war for sure. There are a lot of wars, but not as much as you think. So realists, they are over exaggerate the war situation in international society. So anarchical situations, yes, you have to provide your own security in international politics. So you should have, for that you should have moderate and reserved policy to attain security. But you don't need to have like spend a lot of time or money to have more power, because a war is rare than you think. Why? Modern military technology and the current geographic boundaries between states make conquest difficult, and states will support the status quo. So, two things. The first, modern military technology and current geographic boundaries between states make conquest difficult. So, that's the second argument, that whether conquest pays or not. So conquest is not easy. That means conquest pays. Conquest is expensive. Expansions, it's very costly. So it's not easy. It's not like It's not like 1492 something. It's not like that. It's 2000 something. So that means it's very expensive, and states will support the status quo. So there are two different types of states. One is revisionist. Second one is status quo. So revisionist means they wanted to expand their powers. They are very aggressive, and they wanted to have a higher ranking, and they wanted to have a more power. That's what we call this revisionist. But status quo means you want you to maintain your status. That's status quo. But he's saying that not there's more than one defensive realist. There are a lot of defensive realists, and the defensive realists saying that many states actually want you to have a status quo. They satisfy what they have. That's a status quo. They will not change their status, right? So if you are like South Korea is ranking 5, oh, we satisfy our status quo. That's the status quo state. So we cannot be a revisionist state that much. Revisionist state is very aggressive, as I said. So maybe North Korea is revisionist theory, or from defensive realist perspective, North Korea is doing that to protect their own security. But their way of behavior looks very aggressive, but they actually never wage a war, right? In a real war, the North Korea had some conflict with South Korea, but they did not wage a real war. So from defensive realist perspective, they just to do their job for their security. So aggression, competition, expansions actually lead to security dilemma. That's the counterbalancing behavior increases security, states balance against hegemon. So let me explain. So aggression, competitions, expansion. So this will lead to security dilemma. What is security dilemma? This is security dilemma. So let's say I am a country A, and then somebody is country B, and then we are actually not friends. We are actually in a four situation. So we hate each other. We are not friends. But I bought some like very expensive military weapons, and then the B actually saw what I bought, and then B thinks that, oh, she bought very expensive military weapons. That must be to attack our country. So country B also buy very similar things or more expensive things, and I saw that, and then, oh, she bought country B bought very expensive, more expensive weapons than I am, so I should buy different things to protect ourselves, or to prevent the country B to attack our country, right? This is security dilemma. So they argue that aggression, competition, expansion eventually will lead to security dilemma. So this won't be a good for the country or international in politics per se. And then this counterbalancing behavior increases security and states balance against the hegemon. So when we talk about balance of power, so when we talk about balance of power, it's not about just balance group A or B. When we balance hegemon. So hegemon is number one power, right? So state balance against the hegemon. Why there is war? Structural modifiers. So this is important. I mean, the defensive real is saying that states satisfy their status usually, the status quo, but sometimes there is leaders or other states who wanted to change its status. So if there is revisionists who wanted to change their status, so then there is a war. So we call this structural modifier. They want to change the structure, set structure modify. They want to modify its international structure. So we call this structural modifier, but you don't have to know, but you have to know that why there is war, because sometimes states want to change its status, right? And the main goal of security, main goal of state is security. How can we achieve, we satisfy to this one? We have to attain our security by defensive policy. That's it. And offensive realism. So main difference between offensive realism and defensive realism is how should we look at, or how should we look at the security. So defensive realism, they look at security is plentiful, but offensive realism think completely different. It's a zero sum game, right? Completely zero sum game. Security is scarce. It's not easy to obtain. The states seek to maximize their power. It's similar to classical realism. And war occurs distribution of power and international structure because of distribution power of and international structure. So if it breaks balance of power, then there is war. And the states try to maximize their share of world power and to seek the superiority. And then not only war occurs the distribution of power and international structure, sometimes states wage a war to seek superiority. So to have a more, I mean, to be superior, you should wage a war because you have to expand, right? So war occurs very open for offensive realism. And how can we achieve uh, security, or how can we achieve maximize our power is to become hegemon. Hegemon is great power. So you should become great power, so that it's not easy to be attacked, right? If you are not a great power, then if you're a smaller country, then other countries will anytime other countries will attack you, right? In competitive, offensive, and expansionist policies, whenever the benefit exceed the cost. So they are not stupid, right? So uh, offensive rule is saying that they do not always wage war, but they always calculate whether cost and benefit, whether it's cost and benefit. But offensive realists, they saying that cost exceed benefit, but offensive really doesn't think like that way. They think that there is time that the benefit exceed cost. So whenever the benefit exceed cost, then the countries will have competitive, offensive, and expansionist policy. Then it's more likely to have a war. The status quo powers are rare. Usually, like states are revisionist, but states do not wage a war open because it's yeah, because cost and benefit analysis. The cost, if cost exceed the benefit, the states will not wage a war. So that's why, I mean, inside of their mind, the state's mind, they always wanted to wage a war, but they can't because of the cost. Cost is high or higher than benefit. The status quo powers are actually rare. They wanted to change or they wanted to upgrade their power. And transition realism. So transition realism, there are two great scholars, Gilpin and Ogansky. The more famous one I have to choose is Gilpin. Gilpin is more famous, and then he's a more recent scholar, so that's why. Ogansky is kind of, when he published the article, it was quite late. I mean, quite old. It's 1958 or something. So that's why. But power transition, realism, usually we do not typology, or we do not treat them as one of the realist trend. It doesn't mean that they are not realist. They are realist, but there are only just two or three realists that belong to the power transition realism. That's why when we talk about realists, and then how many realists we have, we do not talk about power transition realism that much. Power transition realism is quite easy to understand. So power transition realism argues that war between major powers is least likely when the international system is dominated by a single state, and when there is the absence of rising challengers being for system leadership. So, power transition theories believe that the assumptions that power transition realist is that power can be changed. That means, there is always that life has kind of cycles, right? So people born and they grow and they become adults, and the height, it's kind of, you have your own height. That means, how should I explain this? So, life, when we talk about life, we talk about like this, right? So you're born and you work, and or we can like say like you have your own the best time in your life, and then you become old, get aged, and die like that. So power is very similar to that. So when there is a small country and they become more powerful, and there is their height, like annex, or uh, their own, I mean, they maximize their power, but after that they start to collapse. Like if you look Rome, or what was the Turkish old Osman Turk, or the great powers that we had, they were all like that, right? So they were smaller country, or but they had more power, and they increased their power, and they maximized power, and then they lost their powers. So there is power transition realism. So their power always does not stay same, or the power always change. There is expansion, so there is time limits. That's a kind of basic assumption. Very easy theory. So major power is least likely when international system is dominated uh, single state. So if it is saying that unipolar is most peaceful for power transition theorists, and if there is no rising challengers. So this situation is very dangerous for power transition realists. But power transition realists, it's very natural that the U.S. was maximized its power, and it's going down, right? And then the U.S. become again like just normal country, not a great power. But China become great powers, and if China maximizes power, then they will lose their power. So it's like that. And then now it's not absence of rising challengers, right? So US is not number one. It's unipolar, and there was no. I mean, that's the power transition realism argued that it's most peaceful, unipolar system. But unfortunately, there is a rising challengers, right? So rising challenger is China right now, and then they wanted to change its system leaderships. And why it's very peaceful and war is not occurred when there is dominated by a single state. It's because it's a single state is in privileged position, And then based on this privileged position, state is capable of shaping the rules and practices of international system in such a way as to satisfy its selfish interests. So because of this, the international politics can be stable. So it's very easy to understand. So let's say the U.S. major rules, right, shaping the rules and practices. What is rules and practices the U.S. made? It's one, democratization. So they wanted to spread out the democratizations of domestic politics, right? And second is capitalism, free market, right? So everyone in this under the U.S. rule wanted to wanted states to join WTO, right? And WTO is actually supporting for free market theory, free marketism. That's the rules and practice that international state that the U.S. shaped international system. And then if you do not join, then you get punished by the U.S., right? So this based on if you follow that, then you'll be okay. So that's the stability. It produces stabilities under this one great power, unipolar system. As power becomes more evenly matched, the war over system leadership is likely to occur. Decline hegemon may launch a preventative war to preserve its status as the world top leaders, or the rising challenger could initiate a war to capture the top spot and all benefits that go along with it. So this is why Walker. This is why Walker. So the Ogansky or Gilpin's power transition realism, talking about different story, right? So like neo-realism or offensive realists, they saying that the two great powers are most peaceful, but the power transition realists saying that no, it's not true. One great power is most powerful because they can produce stability, because they can shape the rules and practice as they wanted. And then if the power becomes more evenly matched, that means if there are two great powers, the war over system leadership is likely to occur. So according to power transition realism, world war, or the war between the U.S. and China will come pretty soon, right? It should be because the war over system leadership is likely to occur in these two countries. So who wage a war? It depends. So he's saying that sometimes hegemon, so U.S. it's declining, right? So decline hegemon, they launch a war first to preventative war, right? To preserve its status quo as a world leader, or the rising challenger. So in this case, China could initiate a war to capture the top spot. So China could wage a war according to the power transition theory. So realist. So let's say the U.S. wage a war that decline hegemony. If U.S. won the war, then it will be peaceful for a while longer, right? Why kind of longer? Because uh, it became world leader. But if China won over the U.S., then China will be number one, the hegemon, right? And then, but it will be peaceful for Ogansky, right? Because China will shape new rules or new practices of the international system in such a way as to satisfy China's selfish interests. So it's not about regime type or what kind of countries you have, but just the unipolar system could be very peaceful, and it produce stability because of this reason. So you don't have to worry about it, even though China become world power. And power transition realism depicts the course of human history as a successive rise and fall of great powers. So as I explained, like power transition realism depict the course of human story as successive and rise, falls, and great powers. Like, as I said, like like this, like they're a small country and they have more power and they maximize their power and then they will fall like that. But this is kind of course of human history, right? And differential growth rates are mainly caused by processes internal to states, including timing of industrialization, bureaucratic politics, and productivity, military, economy, technological innovation. So it explains that, of course, every country has kind of curve like that, like when you're born and how can you maximize power, but the speed rate should be different, right? Based on the internal state, the domestic politics. So some countries industrialize very early, then they start, I mean, they can maximize their power earlier than other countries. So there is timing difference between these countries, but every country will have this curve someday. That's power transition realism. And neoclassical realism is the very last. And then the major difference between other realist and neoclassical realist, you may not understand, you may catch or not, but the most important thing is domestic level of analysis is accounted for their explanations. So far, we didn't talk about much of domestic politics. Of course, the power transition realists, they talk about little of domestic politics, but it's not about like why there is war. It's not important variables. Domestic politics matter because of the timing, but it doesn't talk about much. But most important for the neoclassical realism is domestic level of analysis. So neoclassical realism argues that we cannot understand completely state's behavior without domestic level of analysis. We should understand the domestic level, what is going on within the states. So for the first time, neoclassical realism brings about domestic level of analysis. That's the major difference. So foreign policy is a result of decision made by governments and their leaders, not simply a reflection of international pressure. So there are a lot of neoclassical realists. So these days are usually like neoclassical realists because many scholars actually talking about domestic politics. So when we talk about whether a state is status quo or revisionist, we should see or we should understand the foreign policy. Whether foreign policy is offensive, defensive, or what kind of policies they choose. But where or how foreign policy came from. It's a result of decision made by governments or leaders. So they saying that it's not easy without the governments and their leaders understanding. It's not easy to understand states' behavior completely. So even though there's international pressure, some countries behave completely different. So how, like, I can give you tons of examples. So like Iran, they have a nuclear weapons, right? Even though there is international pressure. So like US saying like, don't worry, we can protect you, but they don't care. But South Korea, we do not have nuclear weapons, right? Because we can't fight against the US. But Iran, they cannot fight against US, but still they do have a nuclear weapons. North Korea saying North Korea has nuclear weapons, right? Because they have their own reason. It's different reason that the Iran has. So how should we understand nuclear weapons that North Korea has versus how should we understand nuclear weapons that Iran has? So the neoclassical realism saying that, oh, we should distinguish between the two because these two nuclear weapons, even though nuclear weapon is the same thing, we cannot completely understand why North Korea wanted to have nuclear weapons versus Iran wanted to have nuclear weapons. Public opinions, regime type, interest group, perceptions, cognitive biases, capacity of states to mobilize resources for foreign policy, we should understand all these things. Like public opinions, like you should understand people and whether a country is democracy or not. Interest groups, so whether interest group give a pressure or not. Perceptions toward the country, cognitive bias. Like for instance, we have a cognitive bias toward China. Like we think that China's intention is bad, whatever it is. So this is cognitive biases. Capacity of state to mobilize resources for foreign policy. So even the state wanted to wage a war, but they do not have enough capacity to mobilize resources for foreign policy, but it's impossible to wage a war against a country. So we should understand all this together. The starting point for neoclassical realism is distribution of capability in international system. Uh, so in international system, there's no clear information related to international politics. So systemic threats and opportunities are not easily identifiable, and there are numerous policy options available to decision makers for meeting strategic goals. So I mean, the of course its starting point is similar to other realists, right? So distribution of capabilities in international system, but there are a lot of other options to think about, other informations to think about. Systemic threats and opportunities are not easily identifiable, so we never know. This is we cannot interpret other intentions, and since we cannot completely understand, so we have to consider others. We never know. I mean, for making policies, it's not easy to get all information that is related to the foreign policies. So there are so many things, right? So that's why there's always misunderstandings in international politics. And this is the I get rid of transitional realism, but if you wanted to insert here, that's fine. But I want to compare classical realism, neo-realism, defensive realism, offensive realism. Neoclassical is based on assumption, based idea. What is the goal? Is it survive or to security kind of things? But it doesn't really matter. But how can we achieve it? And whether it is important to consider domestic politics or not in this country, in this realism, and what is important analysis point. So is it distribution of power? Is it anarchy? Is it human nature? And what are the critics? So this is homework for you. So we will meet on October, right? So I'm not gonna talk about it yet. I mean, on October 4th we will talk about this blank. So what you think. So this is your homework, and thank you for listen to my lecture. And then next week we will start with liberalism. It's completely different reason that from realism. I will see you later.